Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. And on behalf of New York University in Washington, D.C., the Bertelsmann Foundation, the Bradema Center, and the Brennan Center, we welcome you to this special screening of the Bertelsmann Foundation documentary film, Out to Vote. My name is Samuel George. I am the director of this film, and it is an honor to share it with this awesome community. This is a film we made in the weeks leading up to the 2020 national election, and it follows three formerly incarcerated individuals who have become community leaders, and we follow them as they really lead the Get Out the Vote effort in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, as folks know, the rights of returning citizens have become an increasingly visible topic. You know, I'm careful not to say an increasingly important topic because it always was important, but it's finally getting the increased attention. And I think it's worth pointing out that that increased attention, that's not an accident, right? The attention is due to the tireless work of activists and leaders on this topic, many of whom were formerly incarcerated themselves. And in a country where, you know, by some estimates, 100 million individuals have been exposed to the criminal justice system, it's clear why providing a pathway to meaningful engagement with society is so important. Now, when we hear about this issue in Florida, for example, with Amendment 4, it's often about regaining the right to vote. In Maryland, where this documentary is filmed, organizers, some of whom are in this film, had already fought for and regained that right prior to the 2020 election. So this documentary is more about what some folks are doing with that right and how they have become leaders for democracy in their community and how they help engage their neighbors in the democratic process. And, you know, one of the things that is particularly meaningful to me, at least, is we see the positive spillover effect. We see that society gains as a whole when this happens. So when I look at this documentary now and when we were making it, one thing I keep in mind is in this national context, there's so much effort to limit who has access to the ballot box. These new laws send very clear discouraging signals that kind of push people away to make people feel uncomfortable or uninvited in the voting process. And I think this documentary investigates what happens when we do the opposite. What happens when we bring people into the system and increase participation in democracy. It's a film that's about half an hour long, and afterwards it will be my pleasure to moderate a panel conversation featuring some really important voices on this topic. That panel will feature Professor Gilda Daniels. She's a nationally recognized voting rights and election law expert. She's also a professor of law at the Baltimore School of Law. For the NYU folks, she's an NYU law graduate. We're also very happy to have Sean Morales Doyle. He's the acting director of voting rights and elections at the Brennan Center for Justice. And critically, I'm very happy that we have Nicole Hanson-Mundell. She's the executive director of Out for Justice. It's a Baltimore organization that's featured predominantly in this documentary. And she's somebody who's absolutely tireless in her advocacy and organization on behalf of her community. Before we kick off the film, I want to remind you that we are live, and when we get to the panel conversation, we welcome you to submit your questions. We want you to be a part of this conversation. So after the film, be sure to drop any questions in the Q&A box. Another note that I would make, sometimes when we go live, you know, we want you to be able to see this film full screen, and sometimes depending on your settings, it might not pop up that way. And if you're seeing a whole bunch of boxes and you're just seeing the movie in a little box, you might want to alter your view options in the top right-hand corner. Also, there's a live transcript option in the bottom right for folks that may want closed captions for the presentation. And I believe that is all our pre-show announcements. So with that, we're going to sit back, let's relax. I hope you enjoy the film. It's going to take me about 3 or 4 seconds here as I transition to the documentary, and I look forward to seeing you with the rest of the panelists in about a half an hour. Thank you so much for joining us. Hello, welcome back. And thank you for tuning in for this screening of Out to Vote. Now it's my pleasure to bring in what is really a fantastic panel. So as a reminder, again, we have with us tonight Professor Gilda Daniels of the Baltimore School of Law. We have Sean Morales Doyle, Acting Director of Voting Rights and Elections for the Brennan Center of Justice. And we have Nicole Hanson-Mundell, the Executive Director of Out for Justice. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. Thank you to this panel for joining. Nicole, I'd love to start with you because, I mean, first of all, just as always, to thank you for giving me the opportunity to spend time with the organization where you are the executive director, that is Out for Justice, and to learn more about the work that you do. And in this film, when we look at Out for Justice, we're really looking at the Get Out the Vote efforts, and that's what we made this entire documentary about. But the truth of the matter is those Get Out the Vote efforts are just one small part of what you do. So I just wanted to start by giving you a chance to give the viewers tonight a broader perspective of Out for Justice. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for having us. So as the film show, I am Nicole Hanson-Mundell, the executive director of Out for Justice, a grassroots org that mission is to educate, engage, and empower the reentry community around laws and policies that impact their successful reentry. It is through our voices that we lead Maryland's criminal justice reform efforts. We are an org that is constantly engaging the legislative process and teaching ourselves and others every step of the way of the process, from learning what a committee is and when to show up and when to sign up to testify, and how to research bills and how to help legislators fight their bills, right? But also keeping that work closest to the ground and using the lived experiences of our members to impact policy across the state. And we've done that through voting specifically, but laws like expungement, working on Maryland's newest pretrial bill to ensure that individuals shouldn't have to pay while they wait for trial, to the women's pre-release effort, where we ensured that after 10 years, the state of Maryland invests in women coming home from prisons and jails and actually do what its law says it do, which is to provide a community-based pre-release facility that will help women coming out of our prisons and jails in Maryland properly navigate. So that's just a few of those efforts that we have led here in Maryland. And next year will be our 10th year anniversary. I'm doing this work, and this work being led by Black women, essentially, as the organization. And so the voting rights work, though, for us, kind of really kicked off in 2015, where we overruled the governor's veto. Our current governor now, Hogan, vetoed our legislation in 2015 that would restore voting rights for over 40,000 Marylanders. And so after that veto override, we had to go back in community and constantly educate community about their right, because we could not rely on the state. In fact, we couldn't even rely on many of our sponsors to push the State Board of Elections to ensure that we now are eligible voters and that they must treat us as such. And so over those 4 years, we kept, making the law better, and realized, that one other thing that the State Board of Elections wasn't doing was ensuring that our individuals that were sitting in jail pre-trial, those were the population of people who had never lost their right to vote. And so a lot of our work around policy is implementation, right? We pass these laws, but who are the people going back in community being the watchdogs to ensure that these laws are being implemented? And so that is the role of Out for Justice as well. And so in the 2020 election, we ensured that the State Board of Elections did something it had never done before, which was get information into our prisons, our jails, letting that population know that they had the right to vote, and making sure that they got the proper forms. And so that was something that had never been done before in this state since the 2007 policy that allowed for individuals who were once they were off of probation and parole, they can vote, which led to the 2015 legislation that ensured that the minute your foot touched the soil, you had the right to vote. Nothing was happening in terms of the state agencies to ensure that individuals were getting their forms. They knew they had their right to vote. And so we had started going behind the walls. We went behind the walls in the middle of a pandemic, ensuring that individuals in different counties too had the right to vote, because we were making a lot of noise about it in the urban county in Baltimore, but we wanted to also watch some of those more rural counties and make sure that those individuals in those local jails too had the right to vote. And so this year we're going back to ensure that our policy is firm, right? Because, policy is just isn't, we passed the law and that's it. We have to go back and make it better and ensure that it's working effectively for the population that it sought out to. And so that's the work that we're doing now, which is making sure that we can get some drop boxes in these local jails, that we can make sure that the State Board of Elections has an effective program, one in which we are leading the way on, right? And helping the State Board of Elections to understand, because what we found was that they just didn't know what to do, right? They admitted, we don't know what to send in. We don't know what forms to show them. We don't know what language to use with them. We don't know how to change the website to say that people now have the right to vote. So we're finding, as advocates, we're also having to help guide the agencies and ensuring that our people get the right information. So, yeah.
That's Nicole, you brought up so many great points. And one of them that I just want to underscore is that you did all this and your team did all this in the face of a pandemic, right? It's really, really amazing and something that we should definitely not lose track of. And, I think another thing, and I said this in the introduction, is it's no accident that people are becoming more aware of the rights of returning citizens. That's because organizations such as Out for Justice have made their voices heard, and that wasn't easy. So as you mentioned,
it's not just making our voice heard, because I think the important part is that Out for Justice is ensuring that people understand the systems that they're going to have to engage with, right? Throughout their reentry, the social service system, the CPS system, the child support system, right? And so ensuring that we're doing weekly trainings, helping our population to say, like, what are you dealing with in this moment? Oh, you're having issues with the housing agency saying that you can't have your house anymore because you have a criminal record. All right, let's educate ourselves about that system and let's figure out what our actual rights are around that. And so voting is just one of those components that we do.
Definitely. And a reminder for viewers, definitely drop your questions in. We have more of a comment from Debbie. I believe this comment is geared to Nicole, and she thanks you for doing God's work, helping bring people to the belief that their voice and their life counts. Professor Daniels, I'd love to bring you into the conversation here. And sort of just as we gave Nicole the chance to open with a little bit of introduction of her work, I'd love to hear what you're working on. You're a law professor at Baltimore School of Law. You're an author. You're also the director of litigation for Advancement Project's National Office. So what are some of the things that have your attention right now in your work?
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for doing the documentary. It was amazing, as well as all the work that you do, Ms. Nicole Hanson-Mundell. This is so wonderful to see and to get and for this work to be highlighted, and certainly the efforts and the challenges certainly that returning citizens face. It's certainly something that we need to see more of, and certainly need to continue to educate ourselves of so that we can assist certainly in what needs to be done. I am a professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law, and I'm also a former deputy chief in the Civil Rights Division voting section at the Department of Justice. I've been doing voting rights for more than 2 decades, almost closer to 3 decades at this point. So I've been certainly working on an issue and writing on the issue of voting rights. My book, Uncounted: The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America, was released in January of 2020, and it was just released in paperback in October. And in the book, October of this year, in the book, I take various disenfranchising mechanisms like voter ID and felon disenfranchisement, for example. And I try to connect the dots, right? So one of the reasons I wrote the book was so that I could connect the dots. I take certainly history, race, law, and democracy, and certainly connect the dots so that we can see a clear picture of how those things interact and how they intersect to create this system that we currently have. And so I've certainly been focusing on those those areas and in the area of voting rights for quite some time. And at Advancement Project, where I'm the litigation director, we're working, we certainly have our Power and Democracy project. We have several projects. We have a policing project, an education project, which is a school to prison pipeline project. We look at Power and Democracy and an immigrant justice project. In our Power and Democracy project, we also work with returning citizens and work with organizations like Desmond Meade's FRC, Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. We work with Vote in Louisiana and other organizations across the country to certainly to do the education piece, right? To educate and support them in leading the efforts and educating and engaging certainly returning citizens to ensure that people, because one of the biggest issues that you talked about in your in the documentary was the education piece. People don't understand that, certainly depending on where they live, of course, that, you know, particularly in Maryland, for example, when you're no longer in prison, you can vote. You have the right to vote. In 2 states in these United States, you can vote while you're in prison, right? And then there's just the crazy quilt of laws across the country, and that can determine, you know, cross state lines determines whether or not you as a returning citizen can actually have the right to vote, or if you lose the right to vote. Someone going from moving from Maryland to Florida would lose their right to vote if they are still under probation or previously convicted of a felony. So those are all certainly issues that I continue to write about and talk about. And certainly we have federal legislation that's been proposed that would address returning citizens' ability to vote in federal elections. That unfortunately is not moving, but it is certainly something that comes up every year, that is proposed every year. That probably went farther this year than in the past, and hopefully we'll continue to continually move those issues, and hopefully people who are returning citizens can gain the right to vote for federal elections, which hopefully and certainly for elections within the state.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Daniels. Again, the book is entitled Uncounted, The Crisis of Voter Suppression in America. The link to that book has been dropped into the chat box. Before moving on to Sean, Professor Daniels, so 3 decades. Are we at like a low point, would you say, in terms of the attacks on voting rights? I mean, how do you place the current era we're in now with your research and experience?
Well, in the book, I talk about these cycles of voter suppression. We go from cycles of great progress, and then they're met immediately with regress. And so this is what we're seeing now is we're at a pivotal moment, but it's very similar to what we saw during Reconstruction. Once certainly Black men received the right to vote, after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and Black men registered to vote, and they elected more than 2,000 persons to the state, local, and federal offices. And we're talking about right out of slavery, elected persons to federal offices. And in the state of Mississippi, they elected 2 African Americans to the United States Senate. I didn't say the state Senate, I said the United States Senate. The next time, that was in the 1890s, the next time we elected 2 African Americans from the South, the United States Senate, was 2021. From 1890 to 2021, right? And that was, and so you see the example of what happens when you have the right to vote. And that was the first time in our country and in the history of the world, historians say, that we saw a multiracial democracy. And so we saw a glimpse of what democracy could look look like, but that was quickly met with state laws that were passed, the literacy test, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and other devices that essentially eliminated the Black vote in places like Alabama. After the passage of literacy tests and grandfather clauses, the Black vote went from 146,000 in 1896 to 46 in 1906, and that's because of the passage of these disenfranchising mechanisms. We're seeing the same kind of thing today, where we saw this progress, and certainly it was certainly the Black vote and Black and brown votes throughout the country that certainly we saw this surge in participation, and that was immediately met with state laws that are certainly what I call anti-voting rights laws that are trying to turn the hands of time back. So we're at this moment where we can push forward, push ahead, but it's going to take the work, it's going to take the time, it's going to take the effort, and it's going to take the sacrifice to make sure that we can indeed see what a multiracial democracy truly looks like, and hopefully live in this more perfect union that we say that we want and have a true democracy.
Yeah, I sincerely hope that we as a country are up to that very important challenge. I see some great questions coming in from Amy, Malcolm, Jessica. I promise I'm going to get to all those questions, but before we go to that, I do want to bring in Sean Morales Doyle. He is our acting director of voting rights and elections for the Brennan Center of Justice. A lot of folks on this screening tonight are big fans of the Brennan Center, but for those who may not be familiar, maybe you can give us an overview of the Brennan Center and what kind of work are you working on these days, and what are you trying to achieve with it?
Sure. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me. The Brennan Center for Justice is affiliated with NYU's law school. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan legal and policy institute. We advocate for improving and defending our systems of democracy and justice. And we do that in a variety of ways. So sometimes that means doing the think tank policy research and development work to come up with new policies to improve our systems of democracy and justice. Sometimes that means going to the state legislatures and other officials and lawmakers to try to get those policies implemented. Sometimes that means fighting back against bad policy in the courts or defending the policies that we've pushed for in the courts through litigation. And sometimes that means doing public education, outreach, getting the word out into the world, into the media, to help shape and change the narrative around all of these really important issues. And we do that, as a national organization at the national scale and in Washington, D.C., et cetera. But we also do that in all of the states and working with partners and organizations on the ground in the states, where they really are the experts on their state and the situation there. On this, one of the issues, so I'm the acting director of the Voting Rights and Elections Program, so we're focused specifically on voting rights issues. One of the issues that we have spent basically the entire history of the Brennan Center working on is the issue of criminal disenfranchisement laws and pushing back against those laws. And we've used all of the tools that I mentioned to do that. Unfortunately, in large part due to a Supreme Court decision in the 70s, but more decisions since then, using litigation is not often successful in pushing back against community disenfranchisement laws. We've tried it. I've tried it. We led the Brennan Center's effort in a lawsuit along with a number of partners challenging Florida's law that requires people to pay off their legal financial obligations in order to vote if they have a felony conviction in their past. And unfortunately, we won that case at the beginning, but unfortunately, we eventually lost on appeal. And that is a common theme in terms of using litigation to try to address this issue for reasons that we can get into if people are interested. But we've had great success in recent years using state legislative processes to try to impact and improve the state of affairs on this issue, and to pass laws restoring voting rights to people with convictions. We've had great success advocating to governors to do the same, and we've had great success working with elections administrators and elections officials to do the kind of work that was highlighted in the film we watched, and that Ms. Hanson-Mundell talked about earlier, of educating voters and getting them to understand their rights when they do have them, because oftentimes people are confused based on this crazy quilt patchwork that we just heard about. So in the last few years, we've worked on bills and getting bills passed in states like New Jersey and New York, a ballot measure in Florida, which was, monumental, a ballot measure in California. We've seen progress with executive action by governors, the Republican governor of Iowa, the Democratic governor of Kentucky, governors in Virginia. There's a lot of momentum on this issue. There's a lot of progress being made. And I do think that all of these different forms of advocacy, the on the ground work that the folks that we just saw in Baltimore are doing, the work that people are doing in the courts, the work that people are doing, changing the narrative about this publicly, it really is having a big impact. Even when we take those lawsuits to court and lose them, I think the focus that was on the state of Florida as we were having this fight over their pay to vote requirement really made people understand this issue in a way that I think a lot of people don't. It made them aware of this issue. It made folks in a state like Washington, that likes to think of itself as a very progressive state, realize, hey, we've got that problem too that we're hearing about in Florida. We're doing that too. Their law wasn't nearly as bad as Florida's was, but it was bad. And they went to the state legislature, and we worked with folks there to get that changed. And so I think we're at an interesting moment right now. I think that Professor Daniels is absolutely right that we are seeing a wave of restrictive voting legislation that we haven't really seen since the Jim Crow era. We are really at a critical moment in terms of the attacks on democracy and attacks on voting rights that we're seeing. But there is also room for and reason for hope in the type of advocacy that we are seeing and the type of progress we're seeing in state legislatures that are going the opposite direction, passing expansive legislation. And the fact that we are seeing federal legislation introduced as the number one top priority for the majority in Congress right now, the HR1, S1, HR4, S4, the top bills that they're introducing are all on voting rights. And that is because they are responding to their constituency. This is an issue that matters more to people right now than it has for a long time. People are paying attention, and they know about things like felony disenfranchisement. They understand them, and they care, and they're putting that pressure on their legislators to do something. I don't know if we're going to get across the finish line. We're working very hard to get there. We're working very hard in DC every day to get there, but we'll see. But I do think it's important to note that we are at this really urgent, critical moment where we're seeing some of the worst things we've seen in a long time, but we have hope for and the potential for some of the best things we've seen in a long time on this issue as well.
That's a great kind of summary of just these critical crossroads, and it's wonderful to hear about some of that positive momentum, and then all of a sudden these major challenges that organizations trying to rally around these issues are facing. So we have a number of just really strong questions coming in, which is great for me. You're making my job easy. And so I encourage viewers to continue to drop those in, but we're going to start with Amy Werner. She wonders, are there any policy conversations about allowing folks who are currently incarcerated to be able to vote from prison? And I'll open that up to anyone who, Nicole, I know you work on this, so what can you tell us about that?
So in Maryland, like as we stated, we kind of we passed out laws in 2015, right? But it felt like nothing had happened because there was no movement from our agencies. There was no movement. We didn't have much support from the administration around our voting rights. And so it was not an urgency for our agency to do anything or to activate, right? Or to ensure that they had the proper infrastructure to usher in this new segment of people who became eligible to vote. And so our Department of Corrections also did nothing, even when advocates are responding to them to say, hey, you may not be hearing from them, but you're hearing from us, and there's this new law that exists, and you must offer some level of support. We were getting a lot of pushback, but then we found some local wardens in different counties and local sheriffs in other counties that were open to the idea. Now, legislatively, I think in Maryland, our legislator is just still stuck on the fact that they can't get their systems in place. I really feel that.
Nicole, I think you ended up on mute there.
To vote for everybody in jail. And of course, as a formerly incarcerated woman, I want that. But I don't want that in chaos, right? And so it is more important for many of the voting rights advocates in Maryland to say, get your systems in place, get your processes in order before we then say, oh, let everybody vote, because then what? Nobody gets to vote. Nobody is taking it seriously around the protection of the ballot and making sure that it's people in the jails that are specifically designated to taking our people's ballot and doing the right thing with it. And so that's kind of where we are in this moment. We had some talk about full restoration. Of course, I'll support it, but I'm more concerned with ensuring that we have proper implementation of our current laws, right? And that our legislators take it seriously and our agencies take it seriously and show us that they will be ensuring that the current population of people who have access to the ballot are voting. So, we're really concerned about the process and if people who are even eligible in the first place will even have access to the ballot before we want to, be a part of what the federal folks are doing for full restoration. Because we would rather the federal folks really be talking about each state's agencies implementing effective processes for ensuring that people who have a criminal record have the right to vote. And we're not sending people periodic letters at different elections saying you can't vote.
Yeah. Nicole,
Courts are not to the fact that people can vote. So therefore, when if somebody's just gotten out maybe 4 months ago, the courts, it's still reporting to the State Board of Elections that this person is incarcerated, right? So now this person gets to the ballot and they can't vote because the courts haven't caught up with the times and is making sure it has the effective systems that's collaborating with our local corrections to say this person has been released. They are now eligible to vote. And in fact, they shouldn't have never lost their right to vote, because if they were released pre-trial and not yet convicted of anything, then they should still have the right to vote. So those are the concerns that we're having in Maryland with systems talking to each other and have proper access.
Sean, did you want to jump in there?
I did just want to mention, for the benefit of the person that asked, that there are, I think this was briefly mentioned earlier, but there are 2 states where you never lose your right to vote, Maine and Vermont. And as of last year, it is now the case that you can vote from prison in DC as well. And that's actually been the case for a while in Puerto Rico too. So there are places in this country and in the territories where you can vote from prison. But I do think, as we just heard, in most parts of the country, that's not where the conversation is happening, because frankly, we're far from getting to there. We're still dealing with people who are living in their community not being able to vote. We're dealing with people who have maybe even finished probation and parole not being able to vote. And so I think the question was, are there conversations about it? I think there are. I think in most parts of the country where there's a policy push happening right now, we're steps away from that point. And in Maine and Vermont, it was actually the case that they never denied the right to vote to anybody in prison. So they didn't get to that point by moving there by a change to policy. DC is the first place we've seen that, and that just happened last year. So I think the answer is yes, there are conversations, but it's not exactly where the main thrust of the debate is happening in most places.
Professor Daniels?
Can I just say also, I think it's
Please.
very important to highlight what Nicole is saying in regards to the systems, and that the fact that most of the Board of Elections don't know what the rules are, right? And so they are sending out letters. That's not just happening in Baltimore, that's happening all over the country. We're working with Voice of the Experience, which is a returning citizen-led organization by Norris Henderson and others in New Orleans, but it covers all of Louisiana. And they've gotten legislation passed that really moves the needle, right, for persons who are on probation and parole, and certainly has widened the number, certainly cast a broader net in regards to persons who are previously convicted who can cast a ballot, but making sure that those people understand what the rules are, what the new rules are, right? This is legislation that was passed in August or July or something of that sort. And there's an election in 2 weeks. And those people who are now eligible, they have no idea, right? And so it is, and so organizations, like Out for Justice, right, and Vote, and FRC and others are the ones in Advancement Project and Brennan Center, right, are the ones that are out saying you have the right to vote, because these systems, they're so overwhelmed, right? These Board of Elections are so overwhelmed now that they are behind the 8 ball in regards to making sure that people understand what the rules are and that they're abiding by the rules, because returning citizens don't want to break the rules, right? Because they are afraid, that if they register and they're not eligible, they could go back to prison. So they don't. And so we have to, so making sure that people are aware of what the what the rules are is very important. And I think that question was asked by one of my students, Amy Werner. She's a Greek student. She's a 2L at the law school.
And even look, our probation and paroles are not making sure that when our folks are reporting that information is up. That's a state agency. Surely it should be posting state laws for our folks and educating our folks. If we don't want our folks returning back to that very system, then surely we must be ensuring that they have the information.
They don't talk to each other, right? Department of Corrections doesn't talk to the Board of Elections.
Right.
So we have, so that's why we have these problems. These systems that are disconnected need to.
It was a point that Nicole made to me on the ground that just has stuck with me this whole time, and that is the bureaucratic confusion as a form of voter suppression. And I mean, I think that's basically the design, right, of what's happening in Florida, where it's impossible to know if you owe money. But if you do owe money and you vote, that's breaking the law, which can be, have major consequences for somebody that's a returning citizen.
Yeah. I feel like the worst voter suppression is not telling the person. I feel like that's one of the worst forms, is like you just say nothing.
Yeah. That really stuck with me. That's a conversation. We had a number of conversations that stuck with me. And I want to get to another one that we had, but before that, like I said, we have really, really good questions coming in, and one of them is from Malcolm, and this is sort of a specific question. So, it's his sort of suggestion, and maybe folks can speak to that suggestion, and if not, you can offer an alternative suggestion that you may have thought of. But he wonders, why doesn't every state prison have an Office of Reentry Services manned by trained, formerly incarcerated people to greet each person entering the prison, to do orientation and then work with them to get them discharged as soon as possible? And I think a sort of follow-up to that is why doesn't every state have the same office in major cities to serve as navigators for each person being discharged?
You would be telling them to do their job. That would be like, do your job. Yeah. Why don't you? Yeah. That's the golden question.
It's political will, lack thereof, right? In the confusion that you're talking about, this bureaucratic confusion, it's certainly with felon disenfranchisement and certainly the restoration of rights, but it's with voter ID. It's with early voting days. It's with, how do I register? Where can I register, right? This whole, confusion around the right to vote is a form of voter suppression, right? And it's because it is suppressing the right to vote. But I think the ideas that Malcolm has are very good ones. And it's with, to have that type of uniformity, certainly we get, that would be something that we would need to get from on the congressional level, certainly on the national level, and we can't seem to get them to agree on what day of the week it is. So
Yeah.
I don't know if we can get them to agree that they can have these, have an officer of reentry services. But there are some states who are doing those kinds of things. Like in Oregon, they have a system that is built to ensure that people are getting the education and getting the right and certainly getting accurate information, and have the ability to register, passing out, voter registration applications in prison, right, or upon release, right? Those are things that certainly there are some places where those kinds of things are happening.
And there also needs to be some funding support, right? So you got to watch your budget bills, and you got to make sure that you, following a voting bill, that you ensure that there's a fiscal note attached to your bill, that the state agency will invest the necessary dollars into ensuring that when they go into procurement, they have the necessary money to put out there to hire. We tried to get an ombudsman in our most recent bill to be in the local jail. We wanted it, for it to happen all over the state, but that wasn't something we got in last year's bill, to have an ombudsman. But we realized that we probably didn't have to go through the legislator to get an ombudsman, that we could work straight with the agency. And they submit in their newest budget request to the governor a new position. And so we're finding that because we have kept a lot of pressure on our State Board of Elections, what they've done more recently is they went and asked for more money in their budget so they can have a position that specifically focuses on returning citizens. So we're excited to see that from our local board recently. But we were told that that's something that's in the making, that they've increased their budget and to hire someone. So that also has to couple voting bills across the country, that we want to make sure that we get some money associated with these bills, so that we can hire folks to do this, and have the agencies can have the money to also execute.
Yeah, Nicole, one thing I just wanted to be sure to bring up, because it was a very interesting, I think, series of conversations we had last year, is how sometimes it can be difficult for the smaller grassroots nonprofit organizations that are doing some really hard and critical work on the ground to get the attention of major funders that often end up coming back to, maybe nonprofits that have a bigger name but don't necessarily do that groundwork. And I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that, because I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah. I mean, the big funders know it. Hopefully, I'm hearing the conversation is changing around funding too, right? That, some funders are beginning to look at the ways in which it's divvying out its funding into who, and to understand that their best practice is not our best practice, right? We have our best practice, the way. Did I freeze up?
You're back.
Oh, okay. Yeah, funding is always an issue, but what we are seeing locally is this new attitude around funding that is removing some of the restrictions from grassroots orgs to, give these types of reports that make no sense, right? To funders like Ballot, who are finding ways to get directly to organizations like Out for Justice and fully fund us, right? That we can have 2, 3, 4, 5 year funding, and not these one-off 1 year funding opportunities. It's no way to really movement build around a 1-year grant, right? And so hopefully the funders are seeing that. We've seen some increase in our budget lately, but we hope that that's something that continues, across the country, that funders, not just look to the person that they know and ask the person that they know, who do you know? Who are you getting your information from? Because it's likely that it goes deeper, right? And that they will find an Out for Justice, a group that its life is committed to changing laws and policies, because the policies impact us. And so we're the groups that should be funded. And so maybe, some of these students, some of Professor's students will grow up to be program managers and be behind these big funding organizations, and remember this conversation, to always dig deep, always ask more questions, don't just go with the first person, the most popular person. Find out who the most popular person asks questions to, find out who the most popular person is watching, right? And those are the people who you should be funding, and really get out of this traditional.
Nicole, I'm sorry, we may have lost you again there, but I think that the point you make is extremely important.
Grassroots-based orgs.
I think it's a really important point.
Long reports.
Yeah. So I really wanted to make sure we touched on that, because I think it's very important. I think
look, we too busy doing the work, right? Yeah. So if you're gonna fund some technical assistance, help send us some grant writers, right? Help send us some development people, help send us some operations people, right? So those are the type of needs that small grassroots need.
Absolutely. A comment from Jessica Emerson, but it's a really nice comment. And I think it's important that we share nice comments in this day and age, especially on the internet. We don't get a lot of nice comments on the internet, but this is a nice one. I couldn't be prouder to be one of Nicole and Professor Daniel's colleagues. Thank you for the work you do, particularly on behalf of formerly incarcerated women. She talks about some of her former clients that have survived abuse and violence, and are genuinely appreciative of the opportunities upon their return. Sean, I had a question for you. I know you advocate for a series of reforms. One of them is automatic voter registration. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about what are some of the specific things that you think could be done to improve the situation. I guess there's a lot of defense being played right now against the new voter laws that are restrictive. What are some positive policies that people could be fighting for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of them, obviously, that we've talked about today is restoring voting rights to people with convictions. And that is often not one that people think of, although I do think that's changing. But, there are millions of people in this country, millions of people who are living in their communities and going to work, paying taxes, raising families, and all of that, who cannot vote by law. It's not an obstacle like a voter ID or a voter registration issue that is getting in the way. They are legally disenfranchised, and so one big one is the one that we've been talking about the whole time today, and that is passing laws to put an end to that and to restore voting rights to folks. But that piece, and I think Professor Daniel's mentioned this before, there is federal legislation on that, the Democracy Restoration Act, to change that for purposes of federal elections. The Democracy Restoration Act, in turn, is one piece, a very big bill called the Freedom to Vote Act that's pending in Congress, that includes a whole bunch of things. Really, almost all of the policies that the Brennan Center has been advocating for years to improve our democracy are all rolled up in one bill that has passed the House. Well, a version of it passed the House, and it's in the Senate now with majority support. And to run through a few of those include things like automatic voter registration, so that if you interact with a state agency like a DMV or some other state agency, you will be automatically registered with the information that you provide unless you opt out, and your information will be electronically transferred to boards of elections. So we're not, we're not back in the days of pens and paper and that kind of thing. And we're also we're making the assumption that people want to get registered unless they tell us not to, and that switch from opt-in to opt-out really has a big impact. That one has really caught on across the country in the last few years, and we've put out statistical analysis that shows that it has had a huge impact everywhere that it's been implemented in getting people registered. That one pairs nicely with another policy that is passing in more places, and that sort of gateway to this policy was on the New York City ballot today when I went to go vote, and that is same-day registration, allowing people to register on the day they show up to vote, which is really important, both to remove that last obstacle to someone who's showing up, who's politically engaged right before an election, but also to provide a safe harbor, a fail-safe against people getting knocked off the voter rolls for the wrong reasons, getting sent a letter that says that they're ineligible to vote when actually they are eligible to vote. I think last year the whole nation saw that there are ways of voting that turns out can be really helpful during a pandemic, which none of us knew before, but that have always been helpful. Early voting, voting by mail, drop boxes, all of these things that I think a lot of us discovered for the first time last year because we were trying to figure out how to go vote when we didn't want to be around other people. But there's a lot of need for those things to be enacted permanently and become part of the way that we run our elections in this country, because a lot of them just happened as emergency measures last year, and there was a lot of pushback against them in a lot of places, unfortunately. So I think there are a lot of positive ways that we can make our elections better. And as I said, many of them, if not all, are in the Freedom to Vote Act, which is pending before Congress, but also many of them are passing in these state laws around the country. It's just unfortunate that we have these divergent trends where you see half our country expanding access to voting and the other half of the country going the other direction. And so in places like Maryland, even if it does require overcoming a governor's veto, places like New York, where I live, we're seeing progress, and we're seeing our elections improve. We still have a long way to go here in New York, but we're seeing progress. But in other parts of the country, we're seeing these kinds of things being taken away. Like mail voting has been an option for years, and all of a sudden maybe it won't be anymore, or maybe it'll be harder than it used to be. And that is really what's so troubling, is these aren't even necessarily new ideas. Georgia has had no excuse absentee voting for a very long time, and it wasn't until people turned out at record rates last year and Black voters started using vote by mail far more than they had in the past that all of a sudden Georgia's legislature decided they had a problem with voting by mail.
Thank you, Sean. I can tell you it's a great audience here. You're hanging with us. I can tell the panelists, they're really hanging with you. So we're going to keep going for a little bit longer. And Diane Brown has some questions about Florida. So I'm going to try to bundle those together, and they're initially addressed to Professor Daniels, and then we can open it up. Of course, there's a lot of confusion about what's going on with Florida. I think that Sean said, okay, you have some states that are really becoming more inclusive, and other states that are pushing people away. And then you have Florida that seems like it, on the one hand, you had this amazing moment of passing Amendment 4, and then bang, it's going the other direction. So it seems like a really important test case. So Diane Brown references a Desmond Meade and Desmond Meade's work on Florida's suppression of returning citizens. And Diane wonders, do you see any way we can bust through the GOP-led roadblock on implementing the intent of the successful constitutional amendment? And let me see if I can tie in Diane's last point, which was current is confusing. Yes, it is confusing. That's a bureaucratic confusion that we talked about. It's confusing for voting advocates, as well as the returning citizens, for voting advocates, for enforcement. Nobody knows what to do. And she references the payment of fees, but it's not clear for any individual what those fees are. It's like something out of Kafka. So Professor Daniels, let's talk about Florida.
I'll start. I know Sean's actually litigated, certainly filed the case along with other orgs in Florida as well. But I think if we go certainly before the litigation, we had organizations on the ground, grassroots organizations that said, hey, why don't we pass a constitutional amendment that will restore the right to vote to folks in Florida. And it's important that in Florida because there are more than 1 million people, around 1.3 million people. I said million people just in the state of Florida who do not have the right to vote because of previous conviction. And so the idea that you should have an amendment, pass a state constitutional amendment that would restore the right to vote was certainly spearheaded by Desmond Meade and FRRC, it's Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. But he partnered with, certainly with other organizations, partnered with like Advancement Project, was on the ground, knocking door to door to get the requisite number of signatures so that it could appear on the ballot. And then once we got the signatures, it was now, let's see if we can get votes to actually pass the ballot initiative, to pass Amendment 4. And it happened. And everyone was amazed. Nobody thought it would happen. But you see the power of, certainly the power of the people, and certainly the power of what happens when people come together, because more than 60% of Floridians said, we want persons who are returning to have full rights of citizenship. And in my book, I talk about felon disenfranchisement as certainly the new 3/5 compromise. Because with the 3/5 compromise, only about 60% of Blacks were counted for purposes of apportionment. And in Florida, it's about 1 in 3 African Americans, or certainly people of color, who do not have the right to vote. And it's about 60% of African Americans in particular in Florida have the right to vote. So although felon disenfranchisement has been around for quite some time, and we've had litigation about Florida's laws, felon disenfranchisement laws in particular, where the court essentially said, oh, well, they no longer have intent, right? Which is one of the things that Ms. Diane asked about, that they no longer had the intent to exclusively certainly eliminate the Black vote. And while the court may have decided that it didn't have the intent, it certainly has that effect. It certainly has the same effect that it had certainly hundreds of years ago, which was eliminating certainly the votes of Black and brown people. And so we certainly, how do we break this? How do we break the hold, right? That we certainly see that's the question of the day, because you would think the people said, well, let's allow returning citizens to have certainly restore a right of citizenship to them. And then you had the legislature that said, and there's a subtitle of my book called "Free at Last, Not So Fast." So here we are, where although the people said we're going to pass Amendment 4 and want to restore the right to vote returning citizens, that vote was in November. In January, February, March, the Florida legislature said, "Free at last, not so fast." Newton is essentially telling those persons that you do not have the right to vote until you've paid all of your fees, fine, and restitution. And as Ms. Diane certainly mentioned, it made that requirement because many of us thought that it was certainly that the amendment was self-executing, that once it was passed, you had the right to vote. So again, these systems, right, where you had Board of Elections, supervisors of elections in Florida, some which was like, okay, you now have the right to vote, and others were like, no, you have to do all these other things. And so the implementation was certainly very, very difficult. But once the legislature passed the law that certainly said that the fines, fees, and restitution had to be paid before a person could register. There was lawsuits certainly brought by the Brennan Center, the NAACP's Legal Offense Fund, ACLU, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center, and others. And certainly Sean can talk more about the litigation, which essentially said that was a poll tax. That was the equivalent of a poll tax, that making people pay before they could cast the ballot was a modern day poll tax. And certainly the lower court agreed, but that 11th Circuit said, free at last, not so fast. Right. I know, Sean, if you wanted to add how to break the gridlock. We've tried legislation, tried policy, tried litigation, It's really, it's just keep fighting. I mean, you just gotta keep fighting. I told people, the Montgomery bus boycott was more than 350 days. Okay, we tried this, we tried that, we tried. You just have to keep trying. We can't give up. And I certainly, at the center of all this is voting. All those folk who said that fines, fees, and restitution were required are up for election next year. Register, vote, run people to run against them who certainly have your values, and elect those folk, and then get the laws changed. So I think we have to keep going. Sean.
We even saw how it expanded into for our people behind the wall, so it was less attention around them having the right to vote, where legislators were introducing bills trying to get them counted in their census, right? And so remember, we just had a census, and we had bills coming out of the woodwork of legislators wanting to count those individuals that were in the jails as a part of their census. However, did very little to ensure that those people got to exercise their right to vote in that very institution, in that very jail, but was going to figure out a way to count those people in their local jails in their current census data. So those were some of the other pieces of legislation that we saw kind of brewing during the election as kind of like an offset to some of the voting rights work, and saying, oh, they can vote. Okay, then we can also count them in our census in our county, even though they didn't live there, right? They were only in the county jail temporarily. Less attention was going to their right, and more attention was trying to figure out how they could capitalize on our population.
I think there was a question in the Q&A about prison-based gerrymandering, which is related to the issue that Nicole just raised there. But I of course second everything that Professor Daniel said about the situation in Florida. I guess not to make this all about the Brennan Center, because of course this is a story that involves many, many organizations, a number of which Professor Daniels just mentioned that we were partners with in litigating. But I think the Brennan Center's work on this issue illustrates the point she's trying to make very well, which is we brought that lawsuit back in the early 2000s saying Florida's policy of permanently disenfranchising people with felony convictions, every person convicted of a felony loses their right to vote for life, is an intentionally racially discriminatory policy. It was passed, it was written to the Constitution in 1868 for the reason, for the purpose of evading the mandate of the 15th Amendment to stop Black men from voting once they had been re-enfranchised or enfranchised following Reconstruction. And the Brennan Center proved that, and the court said, yeah, this is an intentionally discriminatory policy. But the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said it may have been intentionally discriminatory in 1868, but when Florida got a new constitution in 1968, it put the same rule back into that constitution, but you haven't proven that they did that. They rewrote that same provision into the new constitution with an intentionally discriminatory purpose. And so it kind of wipes the slate clean, and we're not going to strike it down. And so we thought we had a win there in the courts, and then it was reversed, and litigation was no longer an option. And so then, because this is written into Florida's constitution, it requires a constitutional amendment to change it. But that's a really difficult thing to pull off in Florida, where you have to get 60% of Florida's voters to agree on something, which is a very difficult task. So we and many other organizations started working on advocacy to the governor, because the governor has the power to restore voting rights with the Executive Clemency Board through the clemency process. And so we and many other organizations pushed consecutive Florida governors to use their clemency power to do that. And Governor Bush did a little bit more than before. And then Governor Christ did it a lot more. And then Governor Scott became the governor, and he just basically entirely stopped restoring voting rights to people. And so now that's not an option anymore. And the focus shifted to trying to get a ballot measure on the ballot to amend the Constitution. And that eventually became Amendment 4. And we worked on helping draft that amendment. And then this amazing grassroots effort led by people who were themselves disenfranchised and unable to participate, like Desmond Meade, people who were demonstrating to all of us what it looks like to be a true Democrat, small d Democrat, to actually engage in democracy. People who were not allowed to vote themselves were showing what it means to lead a democratic movement and get over 800,000 signatures to get a thing on the ballot, and then to get 64.5% of Florida's voters to vote for something, which is an unbelievable bipartisan accomplishment. And it was this huge deal, and then it was reversed by the legislature. And so I say, give that sort of like history of how we had to keep shifting what we were doing to advocate on this issue to just second the point that Professor Daniels made, which is this was never a short-term fight, and it's not something that we're gonna stop now because we lost the lawsuit. We've been here before. We're going to keep finding the next way to continue to push for this change. There is this bill in Congress which would restore voting rights to people in federal elections, and then would raise this issue again in Florida for state elections. There is all the work that's been happening in the last few years, led by Desmond and others, to get money to folks who owe money and help them pay off their fines and fees so that they can vote, which has helped restore voting rights to a lot of people. There's lots of work going into educating folks on whether they're eligible to vote or not. But as the person who asked the question said, that's not enough, because we had clients, I know people who were literally unable to tell whether they owed money and whether they were eligible to vote, and risked being convicted of a felony if they went ahead and voted, not knowing whether they might owe some amount of money from a conviction in 1978. And that is an untenable situation. And I think that Floridians know that, and that is, they are, many of them, mad about the fact that the Florida legislature undermined the thing that they were trying to accomplish. Because whatever debate we might have about what the words of Amendment 4 meant, there's no doubt in my mind that the majority of Florida voters thought they were putting an end to permanent disenfranchisement for the vast majority of people in Florida. And that isn't what happened. There are 770,000 people in Florida who aren't able to vote only because of an amount of money that they have to pay off. And most of them can't afford to pay off what they owe. That means it's permanent disenfranchisement still for hundreds of thousands of people. That's not what Florida's voters voted for. And so whether it is by holding their legislators accountable at the polls when they go vote, as Professor Daniels said, and telling them, we told you to do something and you went back on it, and so you don't represent our interests, or whether it is amending the Constitution yet again to overrule the legislature, is a question, and we have to figure out what the next best step is and when to take the next step. But I think the person who asked that question, and everyone should rest assured that there are many people who have been fighting this battle for many years, for decades, who will continue to. And the fact that we hit yet another wall here doesn't mean that we're not going to find a way to bust through it, because we've hit them before.
Sean, I really appreciate that summary. The three other people on this panel are all experts on this topic. I am not. I'm kind of an outsider for the most part, and a filmmaker. And I can just say the fact that you had 65% of people in Florida vote for something and make their voice clear, and to, on like a sort of technicality or a game, like they're playing a game, have that not enforced, it's just outrageous. And you're at a time when so many people are feeling disengaged with the democratic process. They say, what's the point? I mean, what message are you sending when people actually do come out and they vote for something with a clear victory and still can't get it implemented? So I mean, it really is, it shouldn't be that way.
Well, for formerly incarcerated people, it's not surprising to us. And I'm sorry, my camera, something's going on with my camera. But for us, we are used to the trickery, right? Like, we are used to the legal system finding ways to incarcerate us, finding ways to continue to criminalize.
We may have lost
I don't
Nicole.
think in Florida who are formerly incarcerated, I don't think they were surprised at all of the tactics, that they're anything like we are here in Baltimore. It was almost expected, to experience some curveball. But as Sean said, we don't give up, right? Just as cunning as they are, we are finding other cunning ways to remove some of those harsh laws and policies that continue to plague the states around this country, and really pushing to work to repeal bad law. I know Sean said that earlier about repeal, but it's important, right? Repeal bills are equally as important as it is to introduce it. So I don't think the folks were surprised, and I think the folks will prevail down there in Florida the same way we prevail in other parts of the country.
Such an important point. Thank you, Nicole. So folks, we're really coming down the stretch here. So if you have any more questions, now's a great time to get them in. Lynn Branch has asked a question that's been in the back of my mind actually through this whole conversation. And it's basically, Nicole, do you have any thoughts or ideas of trying to take the Out for Justice movement beyond Baltimore? And how would that look? Would there be a way to create an Out for Justice office in another city, or would you look to partner with similar organizations? Maybe you already have, and there's a network of organizations, grassroots organizations working on this. Because I think it just does excellent work, and a lot of places are facing these challenges.
So of course, that has been a question that has been presented to Out for Justice. I think, if we do an Out for Justice in another state, we definitely do it in another county in Maryland. We always want to make sure your home base is solidified first before you branch out to other states. But I think the thing is that we need more help, right? We just need more help on the ground. And when you have folks who are really they have to worry about their everyday lives, right? They have to worry about feeding their kids. They have to worry about, going to court. They have to worry about, all these different life things that the constant pressure for us is keeping folks engaged in this part of the work and helping formerly incarcerated people understand that just as important as it is for you to go to work every day, it is equally important for you to engage in the legislative process, because that process impacts every part of your life. And so, of course, we want to, continue to spread the word and hopefully have some Out for Justices around the state of Maryland. But we do have coalition partners like Common Cause Maryland, our ACLU partners, our Life After Release partners. And Maryland is seeing an uptick in organizations led by formerly incarcerated people fighting on a number of issues, from participatory defense to being in the courts every day doing court watch, to groups like Out for Justice who focus on the legislative process, to other orgs that are focusing on employment and workforce issues. So without duplicating the Out for Justice, there are other orgs who are in Maryland specifically focusing on different parts of navigating our reentry.
I think
I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, you did.
You know what, Sean? You always come behind me like, well, I think what the question was is.
No. I think
I hope I'm answering questions.
I think you absolutely answered the question. I just wanted to say that I think the work that to come at it from a different angle, the work that Nicole and Out for Justice is doing in Maryland, I just, from the perspective of someone that's coming, that's doing work in other states, whether or not there's an Out for Justice in another state, the work that they do and the work that all these different state organizations do does have an impact around the country. Because when I'm advocating with a group in, as I said, in Washington or in New York or New Jersey or California or wherever we might be to push for restoring voting rights, the fact that they can look to a place where it's been done before and see how that effort was led by formerly incarcerated people, that means a whole lot. And hearing, there are surely people who are not from Maryland watching this webinar right now. Hearing the voices of folks like Nicole often inspires people in those other movements to do what they're doing. And oftentimes when we're working on a bill in one state, we're trying to bring voices from other states that have done this successfully in to talk to the folks in the coalitions in this new state that are just embarking on something to learn more about how it goes, and to see and to bring those voices that have done it successfully in front of legislators so they can hear the success from other states, and they can see how it can work in their own state. So whether or not there's, whether Nicole's going to like franchise out for justice or not, I just wanted to say that I think that the work absolutely has impacts in other parts of the country, and is not, it's important that it starts from the grassroots in a particular place and people are working on in their own backyard, like Nicole said. But I think that the reverberations from that work are felt everywhere else.
Well, I have one final question for the group. I want to leave it open-ended so you can kind of speak what you would like to say. But, again, one thing that really caught my attention in making this documentary is that, okay, so on the one hand, it's like an individual rights, that you deserve to have your right to vote. And we believe that that's our fundamental belief, that the individual deserves redemption and the ability to have their right to vote restored. But you also see how society as a whole can benefit, or I saw, that's one thing I observed, that when one person comes back in the system and then that person brings somebody else in the system, and pretty soon you have this knock-on effect where more and more people are feeling connected to their democracy. I view that as tremendously positive. I want to give the panelists a chance, what is the benefit beyond to the individual that we give when there is a way to be more inclusive in our democracy? I hope that was an open-ended question and it wasn't a pigeonhole question. Well, maybe it was Sean, please.
I think we're all just waiting for someone else to go first. So the question is, how do we all benefit from this beyond the person who's having their rights restricted?
Yes. And I guess for me to kind of drive the point home, one of the strongest scenes for me is when Monica in the film takes the young man, the 37-year-old young man, to vote who had never voted before. And when they're in the car, he's talking about how he feels detached from the process. He almost talks as if it's not his democracy. None of it's going to help anyway. But Monica brings him into the process. And then you see after the voting, how excited he is and how he suddenly feels, at least for the moment, very connected. And he starts to talk about how he's going to go get other people to vote too. And it's sort of this knock-on effect when we open the doors to bring people in. Again, this idea that it's the opposite of pushing people away and making it more restrictive.
We call that building power for change, where we impact one person, they go back and get another person, they go bring in another person. And so that's how the grassroots group build power for change.
Yeah, I think any of us watching that documentary probably felt the amazing feeling of watching someone talk about the first time that they had ever voted and what it meant for them. Like, that has a real impact on me watching that as someone who has never lost my right to vote. And it changes the way I think about that right and about democracy. But it also, the slogan of Proposition 17 in California, of the push to pass Proposition 17 to restore voting rights to people on parole, was democracy needs everyone. And it was a phrase that came from a person who was incarcerated when they were asked about a number of issues in a survey that one of the organizations we work with out there put out. And I think that's a really powerful statement. I think we all benefit from having more voices in this conversation. Yes. Democracy is supposed to reflect the will of the people, and we don't know what that is if we're not actually asking everybody to play a role in it. But I also think the folks who are so often excluded from that process have a lot to teach us about its value and about what it means. And that's why it is so powerful to hear someone who lost that right talk about what it means to get it back. That's why it is so powerful to see a movement led by people who aren't actually allowed to participate in the most fundamental way by voting, to actually show us all what is possible in a democratic movement that none of us I could never imagine leading, getting 800,000 people to vote, to sign a petition that people who truly yearn to be part of this process are being locked out. And it says something to the rest of us who often aren't using the rights that are available to us and are apathetic about it and aren't showing up to see the folks who are being told they can't participate embracing democracy in a way that we don't, I think is incredibly powerful. And then just the final thing I'll say is, of course, it benefits all of us to welcome people who are living as our neighbors back into their communities. It's the worst thing, and the last thing any of us should want is when someone is returning to live in our communities with us, to tell them that they're not welcome, that their voices don't matter, that they should not see themselves as part of our community is like a terrible idea that won't be good for any of us. And the opposite is obviously good for all of us. So I think those are my thoughts.
Thank you,
I
Sean.
think it's also important that I agree with everything that Sean said. And in the documentary, Miss Monica said that we can do better, we can be better, right? And I thought that was a profound moment as well, because we can do better, right? We can do better towards one another, right? And we can do better as a community, and we can be better. We can be better in regards to how we actually cast ballots, how we register, how people can, how people can access the right to vote. And so hopefully we can certainly move in that direction of becoming better. And it is, and although it's an individual right, it's the aggregation of these votes, right? The aggregation of these rights that make us this more perfect union that we certainly certainly hope to become. Oh, and I think, again, all the work that Out for Justice does, and and certainly the organizations that are on tonight, so that it's very important. And it's just we just have to keep doing the work, we just have to keep doing the work.
Yeah, we can do better. We can be better. I think that's a wonderful place to wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. Just as a summary, we've been listening to a panel conversation featuring Professor Gilda Daniels, professor of law at the University of Baltimore School of Law. We've been hearing from Sean Morales Doyle, the acting director of voting rights and elections at the Brennan Center for Justice. And we've been hearing from Nicole Hanson-Mundell, the executive director of Out for Justice in Baltimore, Maryland. Again, that's the organization that's predominantly featured in the film we saw, Out to Vote. Very brief note about myself. I'm a documentary filmmaker with the Bertelsmann Foundation. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution. All our documentary film work is always free. If you got educators in the audience out there, you got other organizations you want to show this film, whether it be public or privately to your organization, we'd love to work with you on that. And eventually it'll be online, free to access. This has been a presentation brought to you on behalf of New York University in Washington, D.C. They do a lot of programming and all of it is excellent, consistently excellent, from New York University in Washington, D.C. So check out their website, the Bertelsmann Foundation, the Bradham Center, and of course, the Brennan Center for Justice. It's been really a pleasure. Thank you to everybody and have a wonderful evening.